Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency. The final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth. Coming up in this episode, we will be examining the Arizona Wildcats. Arizona finished with a 4-8 record and 2-7 in the Big 12. Head coach Brent Brennan spent 7 years as the head coach of San Jose State, and this was his first year at Arizona.
And welcome into the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network. Special edition episodes coming up all summer long to get you through the dog days of summer. Folks, we have our first patient on the board, and we're going to take a look in depth at the Arizona Wildcats. Let's start by laying out exactly how we're going to do this. We're going to give you how we saw these teams from not only a betting standpoint, but from an overall execution standpoint based on what our expectations were for these teams. We're going to look at their strength of schedule. This is what you can control. Who do you put on your schedule? Your strength of record. This you can't control. That's how well your opponents perform the rest of the season. Then we're going to take some keys from both their offense, defense, special teams, coaching. Then we're going to take a look at what went wrong for a lot of these teams. And then, as you heard, we're going to give the final grade and the final verdict, and then what these teams need to fix in 2025. So without further ado, let's get to the Arizona Wildcats. If you're watching on YouTube, I want to say thank you. If you're listening to the podcast, you can also see the visuals that we're going to be putting up on the screen here. Arizona, regular season only, because we're not going to count bowl games here. 4-8 on the year. Now, from a betting standpoint, their season win total back in June was 7.5. So as you can clearly see, this team did not meet that win projection. Now, when we take a look at our composite win total based on 3 key factors throughout the year, this team actually met our expectations because we didn't have high expectations to begin with. Our composite win total for the Arizona Wildcats in 2024 was 3.8 wins. So getting to that 4-win mark, they exceeded that, but absolutely came short of their projected win total there. Now, let's take a look at their strength of schedule, or SOS, as you will hear referred to. 0.492. That's the 32nd toughest schedule in the FBS this past season. We had 134 teams. Now that's going to bump up to 136 here with Missouri State and Delaware coming up to the senior level here. Now, as far as their strength of record, what their opponent's winning percentage on the regular season ended up being 0.583. 31st best in the nation last year. So not only did they have a difficult schedule, but their opponents performed quite well in the regular season. That leads me to think that Arizona could be on the rise if they can clean up a few things here on the season. Key takeaways. Arizona underperformed their expected win total, largely due to inconsistencies in execution and struggles in key moments. And that is absolutely a fact here. Now, let's get into the offense here. How good was this Arizona offense versus the defenses that they faced? Let's just kind of give some overarching thoughts here, and then we'll dive in here in just a moment. Offense struggled with efficiency. Now, the NCAA average points per game last year for offenses were about 28 points per game. Arizona struggled 21.8. Their total offense, like I said, NCAA average 386, let's call it 387. Their total offense per game was 355. Yards per play, NCAA average 5.8. Now, they were a tick better at 6.2. Now, what were their strengths last year? The passing game was a bright spot for them last year, averaging about 248 yards per game. Weaknesses, this team struggled on third downs, only converting about 46% when we adjust that rate out. Lack of a reliable run game as well. So if you're looking on the screen here, I want to just highlight really quickly the quality of opponents that Arizona faced last year from a pure power ranking standpoint, as well as their defensive power ranking. So when I look at their opponent's strength of schedule, you're going to see a lot of groupings in there from, let's call it 16 to about 65. So when you think about it, there's about 68 Power 4 teams. They faced a lot of teams in that grouping. So as I mentioned, very difficult schedule. Now let's take a look at their opponents' defenses here. And when I look at their opponents' defenses, they faced a lot of teams inside of the top 75. There are only really 2 teams outside of the top 75 in defensive scoring. So this team faced a very daunting schedule in 2024. Now, let's flip it over to the defense. Defense was inconsistent against both the run and the pass last year. This team allowed about 31, let's call it 32 points per game, well over the average. This team allowed 6 yards per play. Pass defense really struggled, giving up 239 yards of passing offense, while the rush defense was not much better, giving up 174 yards. Now, strength, they were decent in sacking their opponents last year, did get 19 sacks last year. But the weaknesses, gave up too many big plays and poor run defenses in key games. If you're looking at the screen here, now we flipped it over. How good were the offenses that Arizona's defense faced last year? When we look at it, you're going to see a lot of teams inside of that top 50 there. So you're talking about teams like Kansas State inside of the top 30, Texas Tech, Colorado, West Virginia, TCU, and Arizona State, all within inside of the top 30. So this defense faced a high caliber of offenses last year's force the scoring standpoint. So that's something to keep in mind as to why this team really struggled. Now, let's talk about the coaching and situational play here. In one-score games last year, they were 0-2 against quality opponents, 0-7. When I look at their turnover differential, a -4 in a turnover differential, that's not going to win you a lot of games there. In penalties, this team was right around the NCAA average of 6 penalties per game for about 53 yards. They were at 6.2 and 54. So they weren't killing themselves with penalties, but where they were killing themselves was with the execution. All right, let's dive deep into the number here for just a moment. And let's talk about when this team won games last year, how did their offense perform? So in the 4 games that they won, they were averaging 33 points per game. They were averaging about 254 yards passing on 8.3 yards per attempt, 13.4 yards per completion, and they were running the ball with a high volume of success, 169 yards, 5.6 yards per rushing attempt. That is getting it done. Also, they were averaging about almost 4 touchdowns per game, only a little over 1 turnover per game. The run pass ratio, they were about as even as you can get when they were winning games. 49.6% run. I'm sorry, 49.6% run, yes. 50.4% pass. Now, when this team lost 8 games last year, only scored 16 points per game. You saw that passing yards dip just a little bit down to 244, let's call it 245 yards passing per game, only 6.2 yards per attempt, and that yards per completion dipped down significantly to 10.5 yards per completion. But here's where this team really struggled. 75 yards per game rushing when they lost, only 2.8 yards per carry. You saw that touchdown per game go down from 3.8 to 1.8, and they were throwing the ball at a much higher volume at 59.5% to 40.5% run pass ratio there. So this team also committed 15 turnovers when they lost versus 5 turnovers when they won. So that is really kind of the nuts and bolts there for me when I look at it. So let's take a look at the difference from when they won to they lost. So when they won, they were averaging about 17 more points per game. They were throwing the ball about 8.5 attempts less. Now, their passing yards per game, like I said, only a small deviation. You're talking about 9 yards per game passing, but that 2 yards per pass attempt differential is very significant for me when I look at their numbers. When I take a look at their rushing attempts per game, when this team won versus when they lost, they ran the ball about 3.5 more times per game. But the biggest difference is they were running the ball for about 94 yards per game more when they won versus when they lost. A difference in almost 3 yards per rushing attempt. That is very problematic there. And you're talking about a yards per play difference of basically 2 yards per play. That is how you lose ball games. And then like I said, being a -10 in the turnover differential, pl only committing 5 turnovers when they won versus committing 15 when they lost. So that is the biggest swing there. Now, let's take a look at their defense. When this team won on defense, they were only allowing 15.5 points per game. Their opponents were throwing the ball about 34 passing attempts per game, about 210 yards per game. Their opponents were averaging 6.2 yards per passing attempt, 11.2 yards per completion. Their opponents' rushing attempts about 33 per game for about 125 yards per game, 3.8 yards per rushing attempt. They were allowing their opponents in total yardage when they won 335 yards per game, 5 yards per play. Now, in the 8 games that they lost, and you can see that's a big number there on the screen there. When this team lost, they were giving up on average 40 points per game. Their opponents were throwing the ball less, about 27, let's call it 28 attempts per game. Their opponents were throwing the ball for more yardage, 250, let's call it 254 yards per game, 9.2 yards per passing attempt, and then that yards per completion jumps from 11.2 to 13.4. Now, here's another difference that I'm noticing quite a bit. Their opponents, when they lost, their opponents were running the ball about 37 times per game, but here's the big number. The rushing yards go from 125 to 198, 5.3 yards per rushing attempt. Their opponents were gaining now when they lost 452 yards per game in total offense, 7 yards per pass play. Their opponents were much better on third down. That makes sense. Now, here's the shocker. Their opponents committed as many turnovers when they lost in 8 games. So basically, this team was just forcing 1 turnover per game when they lost versus they were forcing their opponents into 2 turnovers per game when they won. Start to see a correlation there for you. So let's take a look at the defensive metrics. When this team lost versus when they won, this defense was giving up almost 24 more points per game. Their opponents were averaging about 40, let's call it 44 more passing yards per game, but almost 73 more yards rushing per game. So when Arizona could not stop the run, and you heard me kind of mention that with the poor rush defense in key games, well, this is kind of bearing that out. Their opponents were gaining about another 116 yards of total offense more per game, almost 2 yards per play difference there. All right, so let's talk about it. What went wrong for Arizona in 2024? Poor offensive efficiency. And when I pull up our 3 E's, as we like to call it, was your offense explosive, efficient, and effective? When I take a look at Arizona's numbers for all of those categories, Arizona was outside of the top 75 in all 3 of those categories, and that's why they have an overall offensive ranking of 77. When you think about it, as I mentioned, about 68 Power 4 teams, including Notre Dame, when your offense is outside of the top 68, you're a high-end group of 6 team, as we'll refer to it starting this coming season. Now, let's take a look at their defensive numbers here, because that's the next key. What went wrong? This team struggled to stop the run. As I mentioned, when I look at their adjusted stats here, and I'm gonna run through these here for you. All right, let's take a look at the defense first, and then we'll go back to the offense. All right, so let's start with their adjusted points per game. When we adjust for opponents, this defense was actually a tick better. So instead of giving up almost 32 points per game, we had them actually at 28.4. So a difference of about 3 points per game. Their pass defense was a little bit better. We had them about 17, giving up about 17 passing yards per game, less than what their numbers are saying. So when you adjust for opponents, you really get a difference there. Now, their rush defense was bad, and it didn't improve once we adjust for opponents. It went from 174 to about 169, so about a 5 yards per game difference there. When I look at their 3 E's on defense, was their defense effective, not giving up explosive plays, and efficient? They were outside of the top 90 in all 3 of those categories, and that's why they had an overall defensive ranking of 103. That means you're starting to creep into being one of the worst teams, even when we include the G6 in those numbers. Now, let's go back to their offense here. Their offense was actually just a tick better than what their raw numbers were. So points per game, as I mentioned, 21.8. When we adjust that for opponent, they were actually at about 24.6. So about a 3-point difference there. Their passing game was a tick better. We had them about 11 yards better, from about 248 to about 259 adjusted passing yards per game. Their rushing yards per game was actually significantly better as well. Instead of 106, we adjusted them out to be in about 138 per game, and that is significant. Now, where they have to get better is they're going to have to protect the quarterback a little bit better, and we'll get to that here in just a moment, because, folks, it is time for the final verdict. This is where we hand out the grades for all teams that we're going to put on the autopsy report. So without further ado, let's get to the final grade for the 2024 Arizona Wildcats. And folks, we're going to give the Arizona Wildcats a final grade of a C-. Like I said, they actually exceeded our expectations because we weren't as high on them as the sports books were when they set that win total back in June of 7.5. They were high on the quarterback, Noah Fafita, and Tetro McMillan, the star wide receiver. Now, we know T-Mac is going into the NFL draft, but we just did not see enough in this team from an overall standpoint, especially from the offensive side of the ball, that gave us that expectation. We're just going to dive in really quickly here at Noah's numbers from last year. He appeared in 12 games, completed 260 passes, 430 attempts, completion percentage of 60.5, 2,958 yards passing, 18 touchdowns, 12 INTs. Now, a touchdown percentage of 4.2, but an INT percentage of 2.8. That's telling me you're not taking care of the ball. When we look at Noah's yards per attempt, 6.9, folks, that means you're not pushing the ball down the field on a consistent basis. And then when I even look at his yards per completion, 11.4, that's probably about, I want to say, maybe 3 yards off of where it needs to be. So this team absolutely has to improve on the offensive side of the ball. Now, let's give some strengths here. We talked about it. Strong passing attack. Showed some defensive potential last year. I kind of gave those numbers out in the metrics there. So there are some things to be encouraged about. Now, we're going to have to see how the schedule for 2025 lays out, but that's something to keep in mind. It's not just who you put on the schedule, it's also where do you play them and when that game falls on the schedule. that really determines a lot of team success going forward, especially now that we're expanding out the postseason. Final verdict: Arizona was a below average team, but major deficiencies in the run game, defensive performance, and execution in key moments held them back from being bowl eligible. All right, let's take a look at what this team absolutely has to fix in 2025. They must improve the offensive efficiency. You heard me just give out those numbers where they stood in college football for us last year. Improving the offensive efficiency, key number one. Key number two, they must strengthen defensive fundamentals. We talked about it when we adjust them out from a defensive standpoint. They were a little bit better, but there still has to be those moments where this team absolutely has to get better in key situations. When you're 0-7 against quality teams and you're 0-2 in one-score games, that's telling me your coach has to get better from a coaching standpoint, but also making sure that the fundamentals on both sides of the ball are much improved. Final key, they must become more competitive in close games. As I just mentioned, 0-7 against quality opponents, 0-2 in one-score games. That has to be improved going into 2025. If this team can improve in those areas, Arizona can return to bowl eligibility in 2025. Folks, that is the autopsy report for the 2024 Arizona Wildcats.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at crunchtimesportsadvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.